Welcome to Speaking Freely. Canada has an immigration problem, but it may not be the one that you think. You see, we're a small country with falling birth rates, a slew of boomer retirements, and an aging population. And for our economy to grow, we need a continual infusion of talent and human capital from abroad to make our workforce grow. But for a long time, Canada has created barriers that have left many educated newcomers unable to work in their chosen fields. Now, working in your own chosen and trained profession should never have to be this hard. Take a look at a common example of the challenges that educated immigrants face when entering the job market in Canada. The right to title and the right to practice in certain professions is a legally enforced right in all jurisdictions in Canada. Medicine is perhaps the most well known. Nurses or doctors cannot work without a professional body that licenses their activities. But these rules don't just apply to the life or death professions like healthcare or even a structural engineer. They also encompass personal services like the work of a hairstylist or barber. Here as well, you can get into a lot of trouble if you charge someone for a haircut and you're not actually a licensed barber or hairstylist. Now, for the most part, we as Canadians are fine with these self-regulating bodies like the College of Physicians or Hairstylists or provincial bar associations determining who has the right to practice law, to provide healthcare, or provide our haircuts. We may lack the expertise to determine if the medical care we receive, the legal advice, or the haircuts we get are valid, and we rely on experts in the field rather than as consumers or even government bureaucrats to make these judgment calls. But the problem is, what happens when the demand for certain services begins to grow, or we have serious shortages in key professions that don't allow for easy entry and licensure? Take the desperate state of our healthcare system at the moment. In most Canadian jurisdictions, shortages are even preventing emergency rooms from remaining open in some cases. So this is clearly untenable. So now take the difficulties that a Canadian would have to break into these regulated professions and multiply them by, say, a factor of 10, and you'll begin to have an idea of the barriers present for immigrants or any foreign trained professional hoping to work in Canada. Because unlike the situation faced by Canadians or even permanent residents who have at least some education and training here, many of the foreign trained individuals find that all their educational degrees and experience that they've obtained outside of Canada's borders aren't recognized when they try to find work here at home. Now, is there any evidence that this may be related to some unobserved difference in the quality that exists between immigrants and their foreign experience versus Canadian-born residents? It appears to be no, hardly. In fact, the opposite might be true. Immigrants that do access a licensed profession like nursing or engineering actually go on to earn as much or even more than an equivalent Canadian. Meaning, if given a chance to work in that trained profession, immigrants will do well by the system that's in place and even outperform native-born Canadians. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, relatedly, we have in jobs that require few, if any, professional requirements at all, say jobs in hospitality, such as working at the takeout window at a quick service restaurant. Here too, we have ostensibly job shortages that allow these quick service companies to bring in temporary foreign workers. Now, these are foreign workers that, unlike immigrants and permanent residents, they don't have the freedoms to move from job to job, or even to ask for a raise, or even for union representation. Why? Because the terms of their status in Canada are entirely dependent on their direct employer. In other words, if these temporary foreign workers run afoul of that employer for whatever reason, they have the fear that they can be sent back home without so much as an avenue for appeal. This has the perverse effect of keeping wages and working conditions low in these jobs, which therefore makes it difficult to attract domestic workers, be they permanent residents or native-born individuals. And guess what? This perpetuates the need and demands from companies in hospitality, for example, to keep asking for ever-increasing numbers of temporary foreign workers. Now, as recently pointed out by our guest today on the show, Canada Research Chair, Professor Rupa Banerjee at Toronto Metropolitan University, we need easier and quicker pathways for these temporary foreign workers to become permanent residents and immigrants, with all the rights and freedoms of job mobility and right to voice that immigrant status provides. However, this is only a first step because immigrants and foreign trained professionals also need more help to fill the shortages associated with these regulated professions that are at present are acting more like gatekeepers and monopolists, guarding their particular privileges than as the guardians of our quality or safety. A balance has to be restruck, and Professor Banerjee will help us understand how that can be made real in Canada. In fact, to quote from the title of a recent article that she published in The Conversation, immigrants could be the solution to Canada's labor shortage, but they need to be supported. So don't go away and join us after the break, where we'll learn about Canada's real immigration problem.
Country, yes. Province, no.
I am okay. I cannot say happy. It's a very complex word.
Yeah, relatively. I am pretty happy about it.
Well, everybody has complaints, but genuinely speaking, they're doing all right, at least in my books, yeah.
Well, I'm perfectly happy. We have a good leader, the Prime Minister, who is well respected around the world. We have a good city mayor who just been elected for the third time, and he's doing very well. Well, the Premier of the Ontario, I did not vote for him, but I'm happy for what he's doing now.
There's always room for improvement. We always think that what we do is always perfect, but there's always something we can do better.
The public gets the leaders they deserve. Moving forward, we should make them accountable for what they do. And under the world and global circumstances, we need to take that into consideration.
It doesn't seem to make any difference who is really in charge, as far as I can see. I've moved out of Toronto back in '97. I just recently moved back in, and I see big changes. They're not necessarily better changes. The housing is a huge problem. It's just getting worse and worse and worse, and I really don't see how the city is going to survive with not having enough affordable housing for people that have lower income jobs.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important. I'm under 30, so I think I do need to see representation in the political party that aligns with my own views and not of the older and growing generation.
Well, to be honest with you, experience is always a valuable thing, but a little bit of youth, a little bit of difference could bring new, fresh ideas, which could be very helpful as well.
Always a hope that, there's something new and fresh will come in and will change things for better. But so far, it's not really happening.
Yeah, there's a balance between experience and being in touch with society.
Not younger, but different.
I'm older, a lot older. So yes, I believe that we need some new blood in our kind of leadership in all levels of government. But we need some more matured people. I go both.
You could go with someone younger, but then are they going to have the experience to be able to lead the city or the country the way they should? Or, the older guys have the experience, but then they also have bad habits, right? So you'd have to get someone, I think, that's more middle-aged maybe, that's got a bit of experience, but not too old. Yeah, I would agree. But yeah, there's definitely, we should look at individuals that have different points of view for sure.
I don't think age has anything to do with it. I think it's all about attitude. I think it's about energy. I think it's about morale and the personal integrity. So no, it's not about age. It's about getting the right person for the right job.
Well, I think we need a change, but age, I don't know, makes whoever's going to replace Trudeau, I don't know, or Ford, they're doing all right. I'm not complaining about them.
Sure, not only younger, but also diverse communities as well.
Welcome back to Speaking Freely. Today's show hits home, at least for me personally, being a child of immigrants to Canada first-generation immigrants who didn't speak English, I witnessed firsthand how immigrants adapted to this country, how they formed relationships, and also advanced economically. Now, that question of immigration and integration into our society, into our economy, is gaining a lot of interest, in part because, as recently announced, Canada's immigration levels are slated to reach record levels. More than 500,000 immigrants arrived just this past year and are slated to do the same in the coming years. Now, question here is, how well are we doing by our immigrants? What challenges are they facing? And how can we help them overcome these challenges? Well, with us today is an expert in the field, Professor Rupa Banerjee, who's a research chair in economic assimilation and integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Rupa, you've devoted your career to this question, amongst others, but this has become a central focus of your work. And recently, your work has just left the academic world and entered, I think, a broader mainstream audience. You've had pieces published in Maclean's, you've had an opinion piece in the Toronto Star, and the piece that tweaked my interest was this article you wrote for The Conversation, which exposes general readers to the work of us academics, which was, I thought, excellent, summarized your work really well. Can you walk us through some of that work? And in particular, obviously, the question we're asking, are immigrants ready for the labor market we're handing to them? And what can we do better? And that'll be sort of the starting point.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Rafael. Well, as you said, this is a very, very important question to think about right now, because our numbers are going up so rapidly. Unlike most countries in the world, which really shut down immigration during the pandemic and after the pandemic, as soon as our pandemic numbers started getting a bit better, we opened up immigration more than ever before. We actually went the opposite direction. We decided to rely on immigrants to refuel and revitalize our economy. And this was a really strategic move by the government, but it also begs the question of whether we can really accommodate immigrants into the labor market and into other spheres of Canadian society the way that they should be. So I guess in my research that I've been doing over the past 15 years or so, I've been looking at kind of various types of economic integration of newcomers. And I guess we've seen that over the decades, immigrants have faced more and more difficulty integrating into the labor market, even though we have more stringent and more calibrated immigration programs and systems than ever before.
This is the paradox you mentioned, which is as stringency of who's coming in gets higher, the labor market, by stringency we mean educational requirements, bona fides, experience, we even calculate this, give everyone a score, and then they come here and statistically, on average, they do worse than someone who came in my parents' generation, 1960s, with very few of these stringent requirements. That's a bit of a paradox.
It absolutely is. And I mean, it's not kind of in a vacuum. So we know that the source countries of newcomers has shifted tremendously from the 60s into the 70s, into the 80s and beyond. And so as we've moved from sort of Western Europe into other parts of the world, we've seen huge declines in how people do once they get here onto the ground. So, you know, we've had a point system since 1967, which, as you said, kind of gave everybody a score based on their education, their experience. And now we've really tweaked the point system to another level altogether. So in 2015, Canada introduced express entry, which is a kind of even more, I would say, demand-driven immigration system.
You mean from the labor market? What are employers asking for? And then we create the requisite points on the supply side.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and that was really in an attempt to try and improve the integration outcome of newcomers, because the government is well aware of a lot of the challenges that newcomers have faced in terms of, you know, getting the right credentials and getting into jobs.
And I think over those years, two things have happened. Correct me if I'm wrong. One was the persons like my parents' generation of immigrants in the 60s came during a booming economy. And right at 67, Canada was booming, but into the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, it wasn't. And those immigrants, yes, source countries changed, but as you said, their educational requirements were far better. And often they came from countries that actually had English as a kind of first. They did poorly, not because they were worse, but because our labor market was worse. The other point you just mentioned, touched on it, is how many more jobs today require higher than ever experience requirements from employers and or certifications. Certifications either to practice or even to title that seen now as barriers. Like they ask you, do you have this? You could hire that person, but if they say no, you overlook them. And if those people are immigrants, they're shut out of the formal labor market.
Yeah, and I like to say that Canada's high levels of education among their immigrants is on one hand a strength, but on the other hand, it's been really a double-edged sword for the immigrants themselves, because before the 1960s, when you had immigrants who were generally lower skilled, they faced problems when they got here in terms of their language, in terms of finding work. But their level of education wasn't that high, so there weren't a lot of credentials that they were trying to get accredited or recognized, and they were expecting to start at the bottom.
Right.
They came from labor jobs. They hopefully got labor jobs and hopefully moved up, and they did move up. We can see from the data that within about 5 or 10 years, they were doing as well or better than Canadians in the same position as them, whereas newer cohorts of immigrants, those who came in the 80s and 90s and beyond, their education levels were higher. They expected to get jobs that were at their level. And when they didn't, they had so many more levels of barriers to overcome. So there's also this psychological impact that we have to remember, that they fell further and that they expected that they were wanted in Canada because they were selected based on a point system. So there's the economic impact, but there's also the psychological and community impact that's really important as well.
So you've studied that too, and I want to get to that in a minute, but just make that point really clear. It's such a good one. Is when you looked at those immigrants that came in the 60s and early 70s, even earlier, 50s, 60s, the economic assimilation, that is how long did they take to catch up with earnings with native born, was much quicker. And then, as you said, surpassed native born. Following waves of immigration they come from higher levels of education background. They come with the expectation, and in some ways, the inference is made that you will practice what you're being selected on. So you come trained as, I don't know, an engineer or a doctor, and the promise is you will work at those positions and those jobs, but you're not. And so you fall further. Psychologically, as you said, socially, that can be very devastating.
And I also want to stress that this is not just impacting that one generation. There are multi-generational effects of this, right? So we see that the second generation of immigrants, the children of immigrants, they tend to do very well, right? But when you actually ask them why, many of them will say things like, well, my parents struggled so much, gave up everything, couldn't get into what they wanted to get into, and it was really put upon me, the pressure to do well. So, I mean, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing can be debated, but it was really the impact of their parents struggling that also had an impact on their second
But that's there in the data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow. Now, maybe I can bring the story to a personal level, because what you just told statistically is true. But you were also a child of immigrants.
Absolutely.
You were born abroad in India and came here in elementary school. Maybe speak to me about that experience. And you came in the 1980s, which is when that shift started to occur. Immigrants weren't catching up as fast as native born. And how did you absorb that? And tell us that.
This was my reality, right? And this is why once I decided to kind of study labor market issues, the issues of immigrants was near and dear to my heart, because I saw that my parents and their friends and people who were in our community really were struggling. I mean, I lived in a smaller community as well. I'm from a smaller community in Ontario. And the people who moved there had a lot of trouble finding work. And they were educated.
Your father was a professor back home, right?
Yep. And eventually he did find a faculty position, and he did well. So, we're a success story in many ways, but there were others around us who weren't that fortunate. And so I really wanted to understand how the people in my parents' cohort could be so educated and yet face so many struggles.
Right. So we're now maybe transitioning a little bit into, let's bring it back to Canada 2023. So we've announced these very ambitious goals for immigration, but we have this other program that's often not talked about enough, and you've written about it in respect to foreign students and their work prospects. They are a form of temporary foreign worker. And the temporary foreign worker program is huge in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit how that fits into this whole puzzle?
Absolutely. So as I said, we know for decades now that immigrants have struggled despite a point system and highly educated and skilled immigrants coming in. They've struggled in the labor market. There have been a lot of attempts, policy interventions to try and correct this issue, including things like bridging programs, more settlement services, you
Right.
name it. And then more stringent point system as well, right? So none of those things have really made a huge difference. The one thing that was found to really help is if people already lived in Canada before they became landed or became permanent. And so the Canadian government essentially said, well, two-step immigration is our solution to improve the integration outcomes of newcomers.
Okay.
So what do you need for two-step immigration? You need temporary migrants. And so our temporary migration program became a small component of our immigration system to becoming the overwhelming majority of our immigration system.
Right.
And currently we have, more than double the number of temporary migrants coming in terms of international students and temporary foreign workers than permanent residents.
That's something I didn't understand until you made it clear, which was the temporary foreign worker program is in part a temporary student program first, and then in other words, those students tend to stay, but they're still in this sort of gray zone. They're not permanent residents.
Yeah.
Remind us too, temporary foreign workers do not have the same rights in the labor market that you or I have, or even a landed immigrant has. Tell us a little bit how that works.
Absolutely. So while they do have access to employment standards, in technically, in reality, a lot of times temporary foreign workers end up being in a position of exploitation. So they often don't know about their rights. They often don't know who to go to for help. And so oftentimes there's very mundane and everyday experiences of exploitation within workplaces that they just put up with because it's also their pathway to permanent residence.
Right.
So they don't want to report any issues. And the other thing that I think is really important to remember is we have been really focusing on our international student programs, both to bolster revenues for post-secondary institutions and as sort of a pool of ideal immigrants to choose from for permanent residency. But a large majority of those students end up working in low-wage service sector jobs while they're studying. And so they're also forming this underclass of temporary foreign workers while paying exorbitant tuition fees in our universities and colleges. So there's kind of layers of exploitation going on there. On the other hand, they do have pathways to permanent residence available to them.
Right.
But not all of them make it, right? Only about 1 in 10 post-secondary, foreign post-secondary students end up actually being able to immigrate to Canada as permanent residents.
Do you think that's going to change with these new, because as you said, we had this huge number, this bump in immigration, but a lot of it came from people that were already here. In other words, during the pandemic, we didn't add people because the borders were shut. We had this big pool of immigrants, but those were the group that were here that managed to get that second stage to permanent residency. Do you think, maybe I'm being half glass full in my optimism here, do you think there's been a recognition in higher levels of government that that position of vulnerability has to change and that we should be doing something? Are universities doing enough?
I would say no. I think there's a lot more that they could do. There's certainly a recognition that this is a vulnerable group. And so there are small organizations that are now really making it a point to help
as a civil society.
As a civil society. But overall, because they bring in such revenues to our post-secondary system, it's a really, really tough group to kind of let go of. And what I would argue is that they need more services than what are currently being offered. And also just in terms of kind of community support. They don't get access to settlement services because they're not permanent residents. So the settlement services like language services and other kinds of settlement support services that other permanent residents get access to, students don't. And so they're kind of navigating the system alone. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're gonna leave it there. And when we come back, I wanna get to those potential solutions to make the immigration pathway a runway as opposed to an obstacle. So when we come back, we'll speak with Professor Banerjee a bit more about the issue of immigration and our labor market. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're talking with Professor Rupa Banerjee, Canada Research Chair in the Economic Integration and Entrepreneurship of Immigrants at Toronto Metropolitan University. And her work has zeroed in on the question of the day, it seems, in Canada, which is how will immigrants fare in today's labor market and how have they fared recently? And what steps can we take to make that economic integration a better one, both for the immigrants and for the Canadian economy? So thank you, Rupa. So I wanted to start with just an anecdote that was told to me, a couple of them, and you can then broaden it out to the research you've done. One story, I went to my optometrist, my glasses had broken, and a person who was with a South African accent came down to see me and just spoke about we just started talking about his journey to Canada. He came on this elevated point system. Imagine this, a trained professional optometrist, the highest, academic credentials you could see, the financial requirements to come. And he was already talking about leaving, and he'd been here only a year. And it's because he was finding it hard to practice in the area that he was trained.
Right.
Similar issue, but this time, if you can believe it, with a Canadian-born person, but who spent time abroad, studied abroad, worked abroad, and wanted to come back, could not find work. They were not looking at her experience and her education abroad as anything of value. So these are barriers that are quite hard to overcome overnight. But as you said, we are ramping up immigration to levels we've never seen historically. Where's the disconnect? Because it seems like we've only focused in Canada on supply side. And I know some economists who praise this new system and the special category that you mentioned, this NOC category that brings in the express entry. And they're claiming this is what's led to this great outcome for this generation of immigrants. And I'm saying, no, they came in during a hot labor market. You wait till the labor market dampens down and you'll see those outcomes fall. How can we do better? And how can we refocus a little more on the demand side, that is with our employers and our institutions here in Canada, that will allow these persons, both Canadians who go abroad and also immigrants who come? Yeah,
so I think there's a few issues and questions kind of inherent in what you're saying here. The first is the fact that foreign work experience that's acquired anywhere abroad, but in particular in countries that are considered to be developing countries, are pretty much worth zero in Canada, according to Canadian employers. So if you look at the impact of having a year of experience in a different country, it's not going to do much for you.
So this matches up with the anecdotes. In other words, this is research that's called from data.
So even more than educational credentials, foreign experience is downgraded even more in Canada. And so that's a major, major issue. And I have to say that the Canadian government is very well aware of this. So IRCC, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship, basically used that information to tweak express entry. And essentially, we now have very young people arriving as the newest cohorts of immigrants who have essentially no work experience abroad, because we know that it's not worth anything, essentially. And so, that's one major issue in terms of the anecdote that you just gave. But I think that the other important factor to consider is it's not just about high levels of education. As you say, it's about who do we actually need in this country and who actually is required in our labor market. And so again, I have to hand it to the government that in the latest iteration, they've tried to expand the eligible list of occupations that can apply to become permanent residents through express entry. So whereas before it was really people with university education and a much smaller list of those without a university education, that list has actually expanded so that more, I would say, college educated and trades-educated folks are eligible to come in. The question is this really going to be greeted with jobs for those folks? And that's a question that's up in the air, because what we have seen is that there is demand in a lot of these fields. Yet, for example, in trades, certainly there's a lot of, shortage of labor.
These are people, electricians,
absolutely,
pipe fitters,
and we've really not used immigration to deal with that labor shortage. But that's something that, it has been talked about a lot, and we'll see if that actually is addressed with the newest iteration of express entry. I have my doubts because, Rafael, we also have this, regulatory system with hundreds of regulatory bodies of different occupational fields that those folks also need to cross in order to then practice their occupation, their profession.
And this is something in our field we've talked about before, the monopoly phase versus the voice phase. So what Professor Banerjee is mentioning are these certified professional associations, which are gatekeepers, if you will. And I know that term has been used by several politicians, but in this sense, it's actually the truth. you cannot practice, you cannot, or work in that titled profession. You might be able to do that kind of work, but you can't call yourself that. Either way, that's a barrier to doing work. And in my own research, I think we've spoken about this, and you've seen persons who are immigrants or who have come from abroad are less likely to have access to these very lucrative, sometimes, certifications. And we need to work with those bodies, which are at the sub-government level, right? Governments have just devolved their power to these authorities and let them run the show. And in many cases, that's fine. But when you bring in immigrants, as you say, who have these specific skills, they're not gonna be able to work. As you said, this is the danger. They will too face that fall, right? The expectation level here. And then they're told, no, you're gonna have to work at, I don't know, a fast food joint.
Absolutely.
Until you get recertified.
Absolutely. And so, you know, like in Ontario, for example, and several other provinces, they've introduced these fairness commissioners, right, to try and improve kind of the opaqueness of the process and access, with mixed success. So some regulatory bodies have done a better job than others, whereas a recent evaluation has found that overall, there's been very little improvement in terms of access to newcomers to many of these regulated professions, even in the skilled trades, the red seal trades, where there's so much labor demand. And so, you know, that kind of mismatch between what's really needed and who's really coming in is hopefully going to be addressed to some extent. But I think the missing piece here is the context of reception. So what I mean by that is you can try and calibrate who comes in, try and match it up with labor demand, etc. But actually having Canadian employers and Canadian society accept these individuals, including the regulatory bodies, by the way, is another step of the process that I think we have not done a great job on.
It's very hard because if you think of the context of the pandemic, think of what we were facing. And even then, only now are medical associations toying with the ability for people who have been trained abroad, again, Canadians in many cases, to have a faster residency and access in nursing, in medicine, where we have clearly need. If we couldn't do it during a pandemic, how are we going to do it? We need I guess my question for you is, what is needed to move the dial, to use a cliche, on employers, on certification associations that at present maybe are talking a good game, and even our larger employers, like you mentioned, the banks and sort of out of the break have hired more recent immigrants. But what can be done to actually make those changes more substantial for this large new wave of immigrants that are coming?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think some of it will be, you know, just because of necessity.
Yeah.
So as the labor shortage, you know, intensifies and there's just not going to be a choice but to hire newcomers.
You wrote about this recently.
Absolutely. So that will, we hope, will help.
Yeah.
But I think that there's an education that is needed among employers and those who are actually doing the hiring to understand, you know, bias, for example, internal bias, this feeling of Canadianness and what that really means. So this requirement for Canadian experience is a very difficult to understand kind of requirement because it's really not about the Canadian work experience necessarily. It's much more about this sense that you and I, we're similar.
Right.
We can talk to each other.
Right.
And so it's not just about language knowledge, it's about understanding a common shared context. And until the employers and the regulatory bodies and the society at large really understands that it's not just about rhetoric at the government level. It's really about actually, you know, incorporating those folks that are coming in who are supposed to be the saviors of our labor market.
Right.
You know, we won't really make headway, and that's the real kind of crux of the issue there.
So, you know, this idea of the experiential requirement. Just maybe drift into another area of your expertise or our shared expertise, and that is that youth have perennially faced a barrier in the labor market that's similar to immigrants because they too come with no Canadian experience. They've been in school, and their unemployment rates, as you know, are always higher, and than the older age population. So, if anything, these tweaks that we can do in the labor market, I guess from political mobilization standpoint, people think, well, why are we doing all this to help immigrants? Immigrants chose to come here. They know it's hard, but you're actually helping everyone. You're helping your sons and daughters break into a labor market that's been perennially kind of shutting them out. I had this thought, which is, what if we actually did the same requirements on the supply side, but for employers. In other words, you can't bring in this many immigrants until this many employers have gone through some training about hiring and about, what do you think about that idea?
Well, you know,
is that too much? Too much government?
I think that might be, I don't think that that would really fly,
Okay,
to be
all right.
honest, but I think that the idea that there needs to be kind of like a meeting in the middle,
right,
where this is not, you know, there's often this rhetoric that immigration and immigrant integration is a two-way street, right? That it's not just the immigrant who comes and has to completely transform themselves in order to somehow make it in societies, particularly in an immigrant receiving society like Canada, that's basically asking for immigrants to come here, right? That there needs to be a meeting in the middle, that there needs to be you know, adjustments and alterations in kind of mindset within employers to really be able to kind of make this work. Because otherwise, all of the hopes that we have pinned on newcomers to help us really revitalize our economy and fix our labor shortages, it will be all, you know, at waste, I would say. And, you know who suffers the most are newcomers who came in the last 10 years. Because those are the folks who will really, you know, not be able to find work because there's even more of a supply of workers competing with them.
Right. There's this tendency in labor markets that if you haven't made it by a certain date, you won't make it at all, right? And you have this permanent hit. And, you know, think of a labor market experience, someone who came 4 years ago. Almost 3 years of that was affected by the pandemic. So now you've been here 5 years, you don't have a very, you know, good-looking CV. You're going to be this is a good point. You might be at a disadvantage to the recent immigrant who doesn't face that kind of potential barrier that you know appears in your labor market experience.
Yes, and especially with the huge numbers, right? With you know 1.45 million.
Well, can you tell
our
audience what the numbers are? Maybe.
Well, you know, we adjusted our numbers after the pandemic, as I said, right? So we used to have between 250 and 300,000 immigrants for decades
per year.
Year.
Okay.
And when the pandemic came, of course, everything really shut down quite a lot. But as soon as the borders opened up a little bit, we decided we're going to get closer to 400,000. And then very quickly that number increased again. To 430,000, and then it became 445,000. And by 2025, it's going to be 500,000. And they've met the numbers for 2022 without any problems. And I expect that they'll do the same in 2023. So even with the kind of problems within the immigration system that we hear about, the backlogs, etc., we are able to actually bring in the numbers so far. But we have no guarantee that we will remain kind of the top choice of immigrants globally if we don't do something to actually improve outcomes after those folks arrive.
This is crucial, I think, because even if you buy into the immigrant pathway to our economy, tell us a little bit about, and maybe we can end on this theme, immigrants aren't necessarily always going to come to Canada if they experience this drop, right? The expectation is set here, and then they actually get this.
Yeah.
Information travels very quickly now.
Especially now with social media, we can see that there's more return migration and onward migration.
So
yes, absolutely.
Data, right? Okay.
And also the quality of the immigrants will change.
Right.
So if you want the best and the brightest, the kind of rhetoric we use, then you need to treat the best and the brightest as the best and the brightest. And so once, if we don't do that, then you're not going to get kind of the quality of individuals that you necessarily want, or the numbers, or the ones that actually will help Canada prosper going forward.
So sadly, the story that I heard, the anecdote, but personally lived experience, matches up with the reality of what we're hearing and seeing in the data.
Absolutely. But I want to be nuanced here. There are folks who are making it through their own grit and various kinds of pathways that are allowing some to make it. But that doesn't change the broader story, which remains one of real struggle and challenge and difficulty, despite the fact that we're making all of these efforts at a policy level to try and increase the numbers and increase the points. We really have this disconnect in the middle of how they do once they arrive.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rupa, for sharing your work with the audience. And also, I think our audience has come away knowing a lot more about our immigration system now, and also the things that are problem points and where we have to fix things if Canada is going to succeed in the 21st century. So join us after the break.
I think so. My understanding is democracy is about the people, and then we elect one person to voice our opinion of the general consensus. So I think it's more important that we do see someone that is more aligned with the younger point of view.
Yes, while you always need oversight, a little bit of individual voice helps a lot. Give the people what they would like, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think the governments really have too much power. They should, especially with this new, I think there's a new law now that mayor has, where they can only, I think it's regarding new buildings that they can put up and new housing. They only need 1/3 of the caucus vote rather than 50% of it. So I think that just creates more corruption within the government itself, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's by definition what a democracy is. Each and every one of us should have a say. And that's why our soldiers and forefathers have fought in the past, so that we can all have a say. Whether it's right or wrong, your say is your say. And that, being a Canadian citizen, has helped us define what we truly are. Go Canada.
I think they have too much now. I was whining and complaining about something. Crybabies.
Your say is by voting, right? And through your constituents. I think beyond that, how much more would you be doing? Because then it would become too many opinions, in my opinion.
Too much say causes too much problem.
Well, you know, I always give an example for a democracy, Switzerland. And in Switzerland, what they do is that when they have a issue that needs to be decided, they don't have that decided on their behalf by politicians, but they hold referendums. I don't know how difficult that is to hold a referendum on just about everything, but I think that that's pretty much as close to democracy as you can get, when people actually get to vote on individual issues, rather than having a representative that does it on their behalf, because then you're pretty much at the hands of your representative rather than your own. So I would like to see that maybe people have more input on individual issues, where they get to vote actually as a whole, as a population, on a specific issue, rather than having a politician decide it on your behalf.
I'm proud, I live, and I'm citizen of this country. We can do whatever we want, we can say whatever we want, and we are free. We are free, and I'm so happy to be living in this democratic country. Well, as an immigrant, I'm so proud. Got the chance to come and live in this big, beautiful country, and given this beautiful opportunities, so long as we work hard and we strive hard, persevere, and we will all be happy, you know. And I'm so thankful.
Welcome back. Well, I hope this segment has helped familiarize some of you with the challenges that recent immigrants are facing when entering the Canadian labor market in the first quarter of the 21st century. Now, if you've had parents or grandparents or even yourself immigrated several decades ago, it's more than likely that the challenges that were faced then, though similar, were of a different order than the ones faced by immigrants today. See, what we need in Canada is to match that same energy and interest we've shown on the supply side, that is, how rigorously we select our immigrants now, and refocus just a little bit more energy on the demand side, perhaps educating and training our employers for the new wave of immigration to come. Now, in terms of absolute levels, it's true, immigration has never been higher, approaching 500,000 immigrants per year by 2025. Now, this may seem for some like a bridge too far and a problem for us as a society, but we have to remember that in the early part of the 20th century and in the early post-war World II period in Canada, in relative terms at least, we successfully absorbed more immigrants than any nation has ever done in the entire world, even more so than the United States. That's right, relative to our size, no country has created the kind of multicultural diversity in its large and mid-sized urban centers than Canada has. Now the question is, can we do it again? And the answer is yes, but only, as Professor Banerjee has reminded us today, by making the necessary changes like lowering barriers to working in certain professions, and by getting employers and professional bodies to recognize foreign training and education and experience, and not by exploiting workers who have either studied abroad in Canada or who are here as temporary foreign workers. We need better pathways to integration and a labor market that is open, tolerant, and flexible for all newcomers, which includes, paradoxically, all youth who enter the labor market for the first time, and also to Canadians who have chosen to work and study abroad, but who have a desire to return. All of these individuals would benefit, as immigrants would, from an economy and a labor market that is barrier-free and open to talent from wherever it comes. So thanks once again for joining us on Speaking Freely. And as always, I encourage you to stay curious and compassionate. See you again soon.